He sat on the porch that morning, coffee shaking slightly in his hand, not from the cold, but from something deeper. His eyes stared blankly at the screen of the old iPad he used to check the security cameras around the house. It was routine. He wasn't looking for anything. Not until the movement alert blinked red. Bedroom. 6:48 a.m. He tapped the feed. The footage started, shaky and blurry at first, but then it cleared. And what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. She was there. Margaret. His wife of 50 years. Still in the robe he bought her for their anniversary. And there was a man, shirtless, behind her. Kissing her neck. Grabbing her hips like it was his home. Like he belonged there. Frank's hand trembled, the coffee cup fell and shattered on the wooden floor. He didn't flinch. He recognized the man. Jeremy. The same Jeremy he pulled out of a burning building 30 years ago. Back when Jeremy was just a scared teenager screaming from a second-story window. Frank had kicked down the front door, took the boy over his shoulder, and carried him out through smoke and hell. Jeremy was like a second son to him after that. They had Sunday BBQs, Jeremy helped him rebuild the garage. When Frank's real son died in 2015, it was Jeremy who held Frank's hand at the funeral. Now he was holding Frank's wife. In his bed. Frank didn't cry. Didn't scream. He just stood up, walked inside, and sat down in the living room, staring at the walls covered in family photos. He could hear her upstairs. Laughing. The sound wasn't unfamiliar. But the tone, it was different. Younger. Looser. And it wasn't for him. That night, he didn't confront her. He made dinner like always. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, her favorite cornbread. She smiled, told him he was sweet. Kissed his cheek like nothing happened. Like she wasn't being touched by another man just hours earlier. He nodded. He smiled back. And inside, something in him died, and something else was born. For 3 days, he watched. Studied. Collected recordings. He installed a second MIC under their bed frame, a pin camera behind the bookshelf. Every time Jeremy came in, Frank was watching from the shed. It wasn't just sex. They talked. Intimate things. Margaret told Jeremy things she'd never told Frank. "I feel alive with you," she whispered. "Frank doesn't really see me anymore." Jeremy laughed. "He's a good man. But he's not a man for you now." On the 4th day, Frank sat in his shed. There was no wind outside. No birds. Just silence. He took out the box marked retirement that he hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside was a thumb drive, a burner phone, an old camcorder, and a black notebook. He smiled. He remembered what his captain once said to him back in '78, "If someone spits in your face, you wipe it clean. But if they spit on your family, you make damn sure they choke on it." Frank wasn't a violent man. But he believed in justice. And this was war. First step, gather leverage. He spent the rest of that week reviewing footage, clipping audio, labeling everything by date and time. Every whisper. Every betrayal. Every lie. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to fight. He was going to ruin them. When Margaret left for her weekly book club that Saturday, Frank followed her. She didn't go to the library. She didn't go to any club. She met Jeremy at a local campaign office. Jeremy was running for state representative. Frank sat in the truck across the street, watching them through binoculars. That's when he knew exactly how this would end. They betrayed the wrong man. He started the engine. The coffee shop across town had Wi-Fi. It was time to build a new email account. A new identity. and the beginning of their downfall. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, the house dead quiet, save for the occasional creak of old wood under a shifting foundation. The kind of creak he used to love. It meant the house was still alive. Now it sounded like bones breaking under the weight of betrayal. He poured himself a glass of bourbon. Margaret never liked him drinking alone. But she didn't seem to care anymore. She was asleep upstairs, in the same bed she had just shared with Jeremy a few days earlier. Frank stared at the ceiling like he could see through it, imagining them there, hands tangled, voices low and wicked. He reached for the camcorder. Reviewed the latest footage. This time, Margaret had made a call while Jeremy wasn't around. "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending," she whispered into the phone. "Frank is starting to look at me differently. I think he knows something." Frank paused the video. Rewound. Played it again. "I think he knows something." She was right. He opened the black notebook. The pages were filled with old tactical notes from his firefighting days, routines, contingencies, crisis strategies. He turned to a blank page and wrote one word. Exposure. The first step of any containment was to cut off oxygen. Jeremy's public persona needed oxygen, community, admiration, respect. Frank would start there. The next day, he paid a visit to Denny Holloway, an old friend who now ran a quiet independent news site called the County Flame. Denny owed Frank a favor, several, actually. Frank had pulled his daughter out of a frozen lake 20 years back. No questions were asked. Frank slid a USB stick across the table. "What's on this?" Denny asked, turning it over. "Something your readers will eat alive," Frank said. Denny raised an eyebrow, plugged it into his laptop, and watched. He didn't say a word for 5 minutes. Then he looked up, jaw tight. "That's the same Jeremy who's running for state rep?" "The very same." "Jesus Christ. Let's not use the Lord's name here, Denny." "Not for him." Denny leaned back. "You want a piece done?" "I want him unelectable. I want every handshake to feel dirty, every smile to look like a lie. You know this'll blow up. It'll hit the big guys." Frank smiled, just barely. "Good. Let them watch him burn." Later that night, Frank returned home. Margaret was sitting in the living room, folding laundry like any other day, as if she weren't slowly destroying a lifetime together. She looked up and smiled. "You've been out a lot lately." "Just taking care of some old business," he replied. She nodded slowly. "You sure you're okay? You seem different." He sat down across from her, eyes calm. "Do I? Maybe I've just been seeing things more clearly." She folded a towel, her hands suddenly slower. "Like what?" He leaned forward slightly. "Like who people really are when they think no one's watching." Their eyes met. Something flickered in hers, fear, maybe. Or guilt. "I think we should go away for a weekend," she said quickly, shifting the tone. "Just the two of us. Like we used to." Frank almost laughed. "You want to go away with me?" "Yes." "You, me, and Jeremy?" The name landed like a bomb. Her face went pale. "What did you say?" "You heard me." Her hands dropped the towel. "Frank, it's not what you think." He stood up, quiet but steady. "Don't insult me with that line, Margaret. Not after what I've seen. Not after what I've heard." She tried to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time, in 50 years of marriage, Margaret had no words. He walked past her, toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" she called after him. "To bed." "But..." He turned. "Not ours." That bed belongs to liars now. Upstairs, he slept in the guest room. Alone. It smelled like cedar and dust. Like truth. The next morning, the County Flame ran a headline that rattled the entire town. Community leader, state rep candidate caught in affair with married woman. The article didn't name Margaret directly, but anyone who'd ever attended a church potluck or a 4th of July barbecue knew who it was. Jeremy's face was all over the page, taken from Frank's footage, in intimate, undeniable detail. Frank sat back in his chair, sipping coffee, as the notifications began to roll in. Margaret's phone buzzed constantly. She looked at it once, then again, then ran into the kitchen, face drained of color. "Frank," she said, voice trembling. "Did you do this?" He looked up from the paper. "Do what?" This article." He sipped his coffee, slow and deliberate. "I'm just seeing things more clearly." Jeremy's campaign collapsed faster than anyone expected. By Tuesday morning, his name was pulled from all major endorsements. Wednesday, the party withdrew their support. Thursday, a clip from the hidden camera aired on a national evening show, blurred faces, distorted voices, but unmistakable implications. It was the end of his political ambitions. Frank watched it all unfold from his usual spot on the porch, sipping coffee like it was just another quiet morning in Pennsylvania. Birds chirped. Mail arrived. But the house was no longer a home. Inside, Margaret barely spoke. She moved slowly through the days, phone silenced, curtains drawn. She didn't dare go into town. Not after the neighbors stopped waving. Not after the cashier at the grocery store refused to make eye contact. She was a ghost now. And Frank didn't speak to ghosts. That Friday, she finally broke the silence. He was in the shed, sharpening garden tools, not that the garden mattered anymore. It was just something to keep his hands busy. "Frank," she said from the doorway, voice thin like old thread, "I think we need to talk." He didn't turn. Didn't look at her. "About what?" "Everything." He placed the shears down, turned slowly. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired. Like a man who'd already buried what needed burying. "I don't know what you want from me, Margaret. I want to explain." "No," he cut her off. "No more explanations. I want the truth. I didn't plan for it to happen." He nodded once. "They never do. He was there when I felt alone. You were always distant." Frank laughed. A short, dry sound. "I was distant because I was grieving our son. I was distant because I was trying to be strong. And while I was burying him, you were planting something else." She blinked hard. Tears welled in her eyes, but Frank didn't care. "Not anymore." "Do you hate me?" she asked. "No," he said calmly. "I don't feel enough for that." Margaret stepped closer. "We can try, Frank. We've been through so much. Maybe we can rebuild." He took a deep breath, set the tools down properly on the bench, and walked toward her. "You had a man in my house. In my bed. While I was still breathing under the same roof. And that man was someone I saved. Someone I trusted. I made a mistake." "No," he said, firm. "A mistake is putting salt instead of sugar in the coffee." "What you did?" "That was a decision. One you made over and over again." She looked away, lips trembling. "Then what happens now?" Frank stepped outside into the sun, looked over the yard he had mowed every Sunday for 40 years. "Now," he said, "you live in what you created. And I move forward." That night, he took out a second USB drive. This one contained more than just infidelity. Jeremy had secrets, financial ones. backdoor donations, shady property deals, bribes disguised as consulting fees. Frank had found them all during his quiet research. Jeremy had gotten sloppy. He mailed the drive anonymously to the district attorney's office. Justice, after all, should be thorough. The next day, Frank packed a single suitcase. Clothes, shaving kit, his old fishing journal. He didn't tell Margaret where he was going. He didn't need to. Before he left, he took down one photo from the wall, him and his son, holding a freshly caught bass on a summer morning in 1999. That memory was real. The rest of the house felt like a stage set for a lie. He placed the photo gently into his bag and walked out without a word. Margaret followed him to the door. "Frank, please. Don't just walk away." He stopped, turned slowly. "Do you know what it's like to sit next to someone for 50 years, and then one day realize they were never really next to you at all?" She shook her head. "It feels like being buried alive." And then he left. He drove to the lake house, an old cabin he'd inherited from his father decades ago, untouched for years. It needed work, but it was silent. Honest. That night, he lit a fire in the old brick fireplace, opened a beer, and for the first time in weeks, took a deep breath that didn't feel like it was stabbing his ribs. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, Frank opened his fishing journal and started planning a trip. Not for escape, but for healing. And behind him, on a dusty bookshelf, sat a photograph of a man who had once saved lives, and had finally saved himself. The for sale sign went up on a Monday. Frank watched the realtor hammer the post into the front lawn with mechanical precision. She was young, probably younger than his grandkids, full of rehearsed charm and shiny shoes. He didn't care. He just wanted it gone. "This is a lovely neighborhood," she said with a practiced smile. "I'm sure we'll get strong offers." Frank nodded. "Price is firm. I'm not looking for a bidding war. Just someone who'll treat it better than the last people who lived here." She paused, confused. But he didn't explain. He handed her the keys, turned back toward the house one last time. The porch. The tree he planted with his son. The window where he once saw betrayal unfold in real time. He turned away without a second glance. He stayed in a motel on the edge of town for 2 weeks, just long enough to finalize the paperwork. The room smelled like bleach and cigarettes. Perfect. Nothing sentimental. Nothing left to hold him back. At night, he scrolled listings of properties in Montana. Cabins, acreages, old ranger stations. He wasn't running from anything. He was moving toward peace. But before he left, there was one more thing he needed to do. On his final day in town, Frank drove to the cemetery. The leaves had started to change, orange and red flickering like fire across the hills. The place was quiet. Just the wind and the rustle of dry grass. He walked to the headstone with steady steps. Michael Godwin. His son. Frank crouched, rested a hand on the cool stone. "I got rid of her," he said softly. "Not just from the house. From my life." The breeze shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. "She chose someone else, Mike. Someone we both trusted." He paused, jaw tight. "But I made sure he paid." He didn't stay long. He never did. Michael didn't need flowers. He needed truth. Back in his truck, Frank sat in silence for a while before driving away. He didn't cry. He felt no rage. Just weight, the heavy kind that settles in your bones when the past no longer fits inside you. He left Pennsylvania that afternoon with nothing but a duffel bag, an old rifle, and a notebook with his new life plan. 2 days later, he arrived in northern Montana. The air was different there, sharper, cleaner. The sky looked endless. and the silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. He found a small log cabin nestled near a river, 10 miles from the nearest paved road. It had no internet, barely working plumbing, and a wood stove that needed repairs. It was perfect. The owner was an old widower named Sam who had lived there for 40 years and was ready to move closer to his daughter in Boise. Frank paid in cash. No negotiation. He spent the first week cleaning, patching, stacking wood. He didn't think about Margaret. He didn't think about Jeremy. He thought about trout. He thought about stars. One morning, while walking near the river, he heard a faint whimper. At first, he thought it was just wind through the trees. But it came again. He followed the sound and found a small black dog curled up under a fallen log, shivering, eyes wide and scared. It was injured. Thin. Half-starved. Frank knelt slowly. "Hey there," he said gently. "You lost, too?" The dog didn't run. It just watched him. He wrapped it in his flannel shirt, carried it back to the cabin, fed it bits of jerky and warm water. He didn't name it right away. That would come later. That night, they sat together on the porch, both of them silent, watching the trees sway in the wind. "You're not the first one to get abandoned," Frank said softly. "But I promise you, you won't be the last one to be found." For the first time in months, he felt something shift inside him. Not anger. Not revenge. But purpose. A quiet voice inside said, "There's still work to do." And Frank listened. The dog recovered quickly. By the end of the second week, it was already following Frank everywhere, from the woodshed to the riverbank. Its limp faded, its eyes grew brighter, and it barked at every shadow like it had finally found something worth protecting. Frank didn't name it until the third week. They were sitting by the river, the early autumn sun low behind the trees, casting long golden streaks across the water. The dog lay beside him, head on its paws, watching the current drift past. "Shadow," Frank said suddenly. The dog lifted its head. "That's what you are, aren't you? Always there. Always quiet. Never asking anything from me." The dog thumped its tail once. Shadow it was. Frank scratched behind its ears. "You and me, we're the last ones standing." That night, for the first time in over a year, Frank didn't dream about betrayal. He didn't wake up gasping or sweating. Just a quiet sleep, and a dawn that came without dread. He spent the following days like a man reborn. He repaired the stovepipe. Refinished the cabin floor. Even started whittling again, a habit he'd abandoned decades ago. There was something peaceful about taking a piece of rough wood and turning it into something new. But the peace didn't last. It started with a letter. A plain envelope, no return address, waiting in the rusted mailbox at the end of the dirt road. Inside was a single photo. Jeremy. At a political event in another state, Idaho, it looked like. He was clean-shaven again, wearing a tailored suit, surrounded by new faces. And smiling. On the back of the photo, written in block letters. "You think it's over?" Frank stared at the image for a long time. Not in shock. Not in fear. Just with the slow boil of something old and familiar. A kind of quiet fire behind the ribs. He went inside, opened his notebook, and turned to the second page. He had crossed out everything from the first list. Now, he began a new one. 1. Find out where he moved. 2. Who's backing him now. 3. Get proof, real proof. 4. Make sure this time, it sticks. He knew how people like Jeremy worked. Slippery. Charismatic. Always 2 steps ahead, unless you came at them sideways. Frank wasn't angry that Jeremy had resurfaced. No, what got under his skin was the audacity. The arrogance to try again. After everything. After the town. After the scandal. After Margaret. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice. Permanent justice. Frank started making calls. Quiet ones. Old contacts. Firemen. Investigators. A guy named Halloran he once worked with on a joint task force years ago. And they remembered him. Oh, they remembered. Frank Godwin? Damn. Thought you were dead. Not yet, Frank said. But someone's gonna wish I was. Within 2 weeks, he had a file. Jeremy had relocated to Boise, Idaho. Working under a shell nonprofit, rebranding himself as a community resilience expert. Whatever the hell that meant. Same snake. New skin. He had investors. Supporters. He was grooming another run, this time for a regional leadership seat. Frank closed the file. I gave you a chance to disappear, he muttered. Now I make you vanish. He packed light. Left food for Shadow and asked a neighbor 5 miles down to check in once a day. The man didn't ask questions. Just nodded. Frank got in the truck and headed south. The road unwound like a scar across the land. Miles of open space, pine trees thinning into dry hills, and towns where no one knew his name. Perfect. When he arrived in Boise, he didn't go straight to Jeremy. First, he walked the streets. Watched. Listened. He visited the local library, studied Jeremy's new foundation, made notes. Spoke to a few strangers. Volunteers. Staff. He asked questions that didn't sound like questions. And what he found was worse than expected. Jeremy wasn't just starting over, he was thriving. Speaking at schools. Holding charity dinners. Selling a book. A book. Frank found it in a bookstore. Hardcover. Glossy. On the back cover, a quote from Margaret. I wouldn't have survived without his guidance. Frank stood there, holding it, surrounded by clean aisles and fake smiles. And something inside him clicked. He didn't tear the book. He didn't throw it. He bought it. Because now he had what he needed. And Jeremy? Jeremy had just written his own ending. The bookstore clerk was too young to understand what the man in front of her was holding. To her, it was just another glossy self-help book with an inspirational title and a photo of a man in a suit pretending to care. To Frank, it was a declaration of war. He paid in cash, didn't ask for a bag, and walked straight out into the sunlight. The city buzzed around him, cars, voices, the smell of food carts and exhaust, but he didn't hear any of it. His focus tunneled. Back at the motel, he placed the book on the bed and opened it slowly. He didn't want to miss a single lie. Jeremy's introduction read like a sermon. A broken man finds purpose through serving others. A journey from darkness to leadership. Every paragraph was laced with manipulation, each sentence twisted into something that sounded righteous. But Frank knew better. He knew what had really happened behind the mask. Midway through the book, he found it. Chapter 8, A Guiding the Lost. There, in black and white, was a description of Margaret. Not by name, but unmistakably her. She was a woman trapped in silence, the chapter began. For decades, her voice was lost in the routine of marriage. She found comfort, not in escape, but in honest connection. A time together showed her that love isn't about history, it's about presence. Frank's hands clenched so hard the book creaked. Honest connection? History meant everything. History was love. It was years of sacrifice, of standing beside someone through fire and cancer and death. And now Jeremy had twisted that history into a footnote for his self-promotion. Frank didn't throw the book. He studied it. Word by word. Every quote, every date, every person mentioned. He took notes, flagged names, looked up those who gave endorsements. One of them was a local councilwoman. Another, a popular podcast host in the state. A third, a small charity for military veterans. And that's when Frank smiled. You want to lie about love? Let's see how you handle the truth. The next morning, he visited the veterans' charity in person. He wore his old service jacket, not for effect, but for principle. The receptionist was polite, middle-aged, and clearly recognized the insignia. Mr. Godwin, is it? How can we help you? I need to speak to someone about Jeremy Rowe. Her expression changed. Are you a donor? No. I'm the reason he should never be allowed to speak on behalf of veterans again. She stared for a moment, then stood. Wait here. Frank waited 15 minutes before a tall man with a buzz cut and tired eyes appeared. Name's Hughes, he said. I run this office. You've got 5 minutes. Frank handed him a folder. Inside were photos, transcripts, and copies of the articles from Pennsylvania. Real documents. Unfiltered truth. Hughes read silently for nearly 10 minutes. Then looked up. This true? Every word. And your connection? He used my wife. Lived in my house. Lied to my family. Destroyed what I spent 50 years building. Hughes nodded slowly. You know we backed him for 2 events. No more than that. Then be the first to step away publicly. Show people the truth. Another pause. Then a slow exhale. We'll make a statement tomorrow. Frank extended his hand. Hughes shook it. One down. That night, back in the motel, Frank drafted emails to the councilwoman and the podcast host. No threats. Just the facts. Attachments. Links. Clear, undeniable evidence. By noon the next day, the podcast host had removed her episode with Jeremy and posted a vague apology about misjudging a guest. Frank watched it all unfold calmly, like a firefighter watching a controlled burn. Every flame where it belonged. Margaret called that evening. He didn't answer. She texted. I saw the news. Was it you? He stared at the screen. Then typed back. He used your name. I just returned it. She didn't reply. The next day, Jeremy made a statement online. A video. He was seated in a sunlit office, trying to look humble. He spoke of misunderstandings, of false narratives, and personal attacks from the past. Frank watched the full 5 minutes. No apologies. No truths. Just deflection and performance. That was fine. He wasn't done yet. He sent the final batch of evidence to a journalist in Boise known for tearing down corrupt officials. The man didn't respond at first. But 3 days later, an article exploded online. The man behind the mask, who is Jeremy Rowe really? It was brutal. Clinical. Filled with source documents, testimony, and timelines. It traced his career back to Pennsylvania, to the scandal, to the affair, to the collapse of his campaign. No anonymity this time. Names. Photos. Truth. Frank sat alone in his motel room, shadow curled at his feet, watching the numbers climb. Views. Shares. Comments. It was finally done. And this time? There was no comeback. Frank left Boise the same way he had come in, quiet, focused, and without looking back. He didn't wait for Jeremy's career to bleed out in public. That part was already in motion. The media would tear at the scraps, donors would retreat, and the fake smiles would melt. He didn't need to see it. He'd done what he came to do. Driving north, Frank passed through long empty roads bordered by pine and dust. Every mile that took him farther from Idaho felt like lifting another stone off his back. Shadow rode in the passenger seat, head out the window, tongue lolling in the wind. They stopped once, at a gas station in a nameless town where the clerk didn't ask questions. Frank filled the tank, bought jerky and a new map, and sat outside in the shade to breathe. He unfolded the map and looked at the stretch of land between Montana and the Canadian border. He traced his finger along the route toward a place circled in red ink, Bear Creek Ridge. That was where he'd go next. Not to hide. To live. 3 days later, they arrived. Bear Creek Ridge wasn't even a town, it was a loose scatter of cabins in the shadow of a rocky bluff, with one dirt road cutting through tall pines and a single wooden sign that had half the letters worn off. A local farmer pointed Frank toward a vacant cabin on the edge of the ridge, where the forest met a narrow river bend. He bought it in cash the same day. No negotiations. No inspections. Just keys and solitude. The cabin was rough. No insulation. Roof half collapsed. But the view from the back porch looked like heaven spilled over the earth. Frank stood there at sunset, hands in his pockets, watching the sky bleed orange and gold across the valley. Shadow barked once, chasing a squirrel into the underbrush. Frank smiled. This'll do. He spent the next week making the place livable. Fixed the roof. Repaired the windows. Hauled in supplies from the nearest town an hour away. Each task was slow and deliberate, but his body welcomed the work. It was the kind of labor that made a man feel solid again. Present. He didn't check his phone. He didn't care about the headlines. Until one afternoon, a knock came at the door. Frank froze. No one knocked out here. He opened it slowly, half expecting a ranger or maybe a lost hiker. It was Margaret. She stood there in jeans and a flannel shirt, hair tied back, her face weathered from travel and time. Frank said nothing. She looked tired. Smaller, somehow. I asked around in town, she said softly. They said a man with a dog came through. I figured it was you. He opened the door wider, but didn't step aside. I'm not here to cause trouble, she added quickly. I just needed to see you. One last time. He leaned against the frame. Why? She hesitated. Because everything I've done, it destroyed me, Frank. Not just us. Me. I've lost the kids. The grandkids. Friends. My name. He said nothing. I don't want forgiveness, she said. I just want you to know. I never stopped loving you. Even when I betrayed you. I know that sounds hollow. I know it's too late. Frank looked past her, toward the trees. Too late doesn't begin to cover it, he said quietly. Margaret's voice cracked. I've been alone for months. I thought I could fix something. Anything. But I can't. Still, he said nothing. She stepped back. I'll go. She turned, began walking down the path toward the truck parked by the tree line. Frank watched her for a long time. The wind pulled at her jacket. Her steps were slow. She looked over her shoulder once, like she hoped he'd stop her. He didn't. He closed the door. That night, he didn't feel peace. But he didn't feel rage either. He felt finished. Not healed. But whole. In the silence of the cabin, with only the crackle of the fire and shadows breathing nearby, Frank sat at the table and took out the notebook one last time. He flipped past the first pages, past the names, the lists, the plans. And on the last page, he wrote, I survived. Then he closed the book for good. The days grew shorter, and the mornings came colder. Frank welcomed it. He split wood in the early hours, fog rising from the earth like breath from the land itself. Shadow ran laps through the pines, chasing birds he'd never catch, but always believing today might be the day. Life had become simple. Solid. Each motion had purpose, each silence had weight. And yet, some part of Frank still listened for footsteps. For voices from the past. For that last ghost to knock on the door. But none came. Until the letter arrived. It was folded neatly and pinned under a rock near the edge of his property. No postage. No envelope. Just paper. He noticed it after returning from fishing in the early afternoon. Shadow sniffed it once and barked, uneasy. Frank unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unfamiliar. But the message was clear. You think you've ended him. You haven't. There are still people behind Jeremy. People with real money. You made noise. They make moves. No name. No signature. Frank read it twice, then set it on the porch railing, watching as the wind nearly took it away. So it wasn't over after all. Jeremy had friends in places Frank hadn't touched. And now those shadows had started reaching back. Frank went inside, opened the floorboard beneath the hearth where he kept his documents, just in case. He removed the envelope labeled insurance. Inside were USB drives, handwritten notes, copies of everything he'd sent to reporters, plus a few things he hadn't released yet, a set of bank transactions linking Jeremy's nonprofit to an offshore account, and an email exchange with a woman listed only as AG, discussing payouts and silence contracts. He hadn't used them because the first wave had done the job. But now? Maybe it was time to go deeper. He sat at the table, laid it all out, and took a deep breath. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. But he was ready. That night, Frank drafted another letter. Not for blackmail. Not for threats. Just truth. He sent copies of the new documents to a federal investigator he once knew, a man named Cutler, who owed him a favor from way back in the 90s. He didn't expect a response right away. But it was a spark. One more flame in the wind. For the next few days, Frank remained alert. He noticed a car that drove past twice, slow, with out-of-state plates. He noticed a trail of boot prints near his woodshed he hadn't left himself. And once, while out hunting, he heard the crack of a branch behind him, too deliberate to be wildlife. They weren't watching him closely yet. Just testing the door. Let them. He reinforced the locks on the cabin. Checked the battery on the satellite phone. Cleaned the rifle, not from fear, but habit. And he waited. Not like prey. Like bait. On the fifth night, as the wind howled outside and the fire hissed against the stone, someone knocked on the door. Once. Then again. Frank didn't move immediately. He let the silence stretch. Then slowly, calmly, he rose and opened the door. A man stood there in a black coat. Mid-40s. Clean-shaven. Professional posture. The kind of man who worked for someone else. I'm looking for Mr. Godwin, he said. Frank looked him over. Didn't speak. The man smiled. We were hoping this could be a civil conversation. About your interest in Mr. Rowe. Frank still didn't speak. Let's not make this messy, the man added, voice smooth. Just let it go. The past's the past. We can all move on. Frank nodded once. Then slammed the door in his face. The man didn't knock again. Frank watched through the window as he walked back to a black SUV, engine already running. He drove off without a word. Frank sat back down at the table. He opened his notebook again, the last page still staring at him. I survived. He turned the page. And started writing again. The snow came early that year. By late October, the ridge was already coated in white. The pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy under the weight of frost. Frank woke each morning to the sound of creaking wood and the hiss of the old stove heating the cabin. Shadow didn't seem to mind. He bounded through the snow like a pup, leaving scattered paw prints across the yard and dragging in clumps of ice that melted near the hearth. Frank had settled into a rhythm again, splitting logs, reading old paperbacks by the fire, and occasionally taking the rifle out for a walk through the trees. He didn't hunt much anymore. He just walked. Thought. Breathed. The man in the black coat hadn't returned. No cars had driven past in weeks. No letters. No threats. But Frank didn't mistake the silence for safety. He knew how men like Jeremy operated. If they couldn't buy you or bury you, they waited. Waited for time to loosen your guard, waited for you to forget what you were up against. Frank didn't forget. On the morning of November 3rd, he received a call from Cutler. The investigator didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They're trying to freeze the investigation," he said. "Some big names just got involved. Attorneys with DC ties. Lobbyists. It's getting complicated." Frank sat at the table, mug in hand, eyes locked on the frost forming along the window edge. "You have everything I gave you?" he asked. "Yes. But I need more." "Anything else, Frank?" "Even rumors. We're fighting suits with teeth now." Frank exhaled through his nose. "I'll send what I've got." That afternoon, he pulled out the last of his stash, pages of an old journal Margaret had once kept, tucked away in a dusty crate in the attic before she left. Most of it was ordinary, memories of birthdays, garden notes, complaints about back pain. But one page stood out. She had written about a man named Lawson. A consultant Jeremy had met with. Margaret had overheard something about payments, quiet favors, and a foundation board seat promised to someone with influence. It wasn't proof. But it was a thread. Frank scanned the page, uploaded it, and sent it to Cutler. That night, he didn't sleep much. He sat on the porch, wrapped in his coat, staring into the forest as snowflakes drifted down like ash. He remembered the hospital visits. The long nights holding Margaret's hand while chemo burned through her veins. He remembered rebuilding the porch steps after the flood in '89. Fixing the roof after the storm in '03. Buying that damn mattress she later used with someone else. He remembered everything. And none of it could be erased. Shadow lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes watching him with quiet loyalty. "You ever wonder," Frank said softly, "how much a man is supposed to take before he breaks?" Shadow didn't answer, of course. But something in the silence did. The next day brought the first real snowfall, heavy, constant, relentless. Frank stocked the firewood, bolted the shutters, and cooked a heavy stew that filled the cabin with warmth. He sat at the table, notebook open, staring at the blank page he'd written on the week before. His pen hovered for a moment. Then he wrote. "If they come, I'll be ready. But I won't be afraid." And below that, "Jeremy thinks this is still a game." Then one more line. "He's about to learn what it means to lose everything." That night, the power flickered. Once. Then twice. Then it went out. The cabin fell into darkness, save for the glow of the fireplace and the dim light of a lantern Frank always kept ready. He didn't panic. He didn't even move right away. He just stood, slowly, and went to the small locked drawer beside the bookshelf. Inside was an old revolver. He checked it. Loaded. Clean. He sat back down. And waited. Somewhere outside, under the weight of 1,000 silent trees, something moved. The wind screamed through the trees like a warning. Frank sat in the dark, revolver resting on the table beside his hand, the fire casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft but endless, muffling the world in a cold white silence. Shadow lay curled by the fireplace, ears twitching, eyes open. Something was out there. Frank could feel it. He stood slowly, crossed the room, and moved to the window. Pulled back the curtain just enough to see the tree line. Darkness stared back. Then, movement. A figure. Not walking, but standing still. Just inside the tree line. Too far for a clear view, but close enough for a man like Frank to know he was being watched. He didn't open the door. Didn't call out. He walked to the old dresser, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a worn flannel jacket, his son's. Michael's. The one he'd saved after the funeral. He slipped it on, then reached for the rifle. Outside, the wind howled again. Shadow lifted his head but didn't bark. Frank opened the door slowly, the cold air hitting his skin like needles. He stepped outside, boots crunching on frozen snow, every sense awake. The figure was gone. Only footprints remained. Frank followed them. Into the trees. One slow step at a time, the rifle held low but ready. He didn't feel fear. He felt alive. The trail moved deeper into the woods, circling toward the east ridge. Then, suddenly, the prints stopped. Not faded. Stopped. And ahead, firelight. A small campfire, just off the path, barely glowing. Next to it, a folding chair. And sitting in it, Jeremy. Alive. Calm. Like nothing had ever happened. Frank stopped 10 feet away, rifle still lowered. "I knew you'd come," Jeremy said, voice casual. "You never could resist finishing things yourself." Frank didn't speak. Jeremy looked older now. Grayer around the eyes. But his mouth still wore that politician's smirk. "I came to give you a chance," he continued. "One last offer. You walk away now, and I bury the rest. My people stand down. You go back to your little cabin, your dog, your silence." Frank took a slow step forward. "You think I care about silence?" he said. His voice was rough, steady. Jeremy raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in theater. "Come on, Frank. Be reasonable. You've made your point. I lost everything. Publicly. Brutally. That's what you wanted, isn't it?" "No," Frank said. "What I wanted died with my son. What I want now is to make sure men like you never get a second chance." Jeremy leaned back in the chair, studied him. "Then what? You shoot me? Out here? In the woods?" Frank didn't move. "I don't have to shoot you," he said. "You've already done the job yourself." Jeremy frowned. Frank reached into his coat pocket and tossed something into the fire. A USB stick. It sizzled for a second before melting into the coals. "I gave everything else to the feds," Frank said. "That was the last copy." Jeremy's jaw tightened. "You think I don't have lawyers for that?" Frank nodded. "You probably do. But not for what comes next." He turned to leave. Jeremy stood. "You think this is over?" Frank stopped. Looked back over his shoulder. "No. I think this is where you finally learn what it feels like to be truly alone." Then he walked away. Back through the trees, through the snow, through the silence. He didn't look back. Shadow was waiting on the porch when he returned, tail thumping once. Frank stepped inside, set the rifle down, and removed the jacket. Folded it carefully. Placed it back in the drawer. The fire still burned. He sat down. Picked up the notebook. flipped to the final page. And wrote? He came to end it. I ended it instead. Now I live. Now it's mine again. Then he closed the book forever. Outside, the wind finally calmed. And in the stillness of the cabin, Frank smiled. Not with joy, but with freedom.